Recording. Wonderful. Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual education program at Cancer Support Community South Bay. I'm Rebecca, the program manager, and I welcome you to this workshop titled Popular Diets and Cancer. Before we begin, if this is your first time joining us, CSC South Bay's mission is to ensure that all people impacted by cancer are empowered by knowledge, strengthened by action, and sustained by community so that no one faces cancer alone. We serve the South Bay, Long Beach, and Orange County area all at no cost. Our program includes support groups, networking groups, healthy lifestyle classes, social activities, and education programs like this workshop. Educational workshops are open to all. If you'd like to hear more about our services or join a community, please visit our website at cscsouthbay.org. Without further ado, I'll introduce our workshop speaker. Marissa Minderler is a registered dietitian who currently works as both an inpatient and outpatient clinical dietitian at Torrance Memorial. Graduating from USC with a master's in nutrition, health, and longevity, and a bachelor's in kinesiology, she has always had an interest in the role of nutrition in weight management, fitness, and performance, and in women's health. Most recently, she has been taken to exploring the role of nutrition in cancer and how it can assist with prevention, management of treatment, and survivorship. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Rebecca. I appreciate the introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to be here and provide you with this presentation. Something I'm very passionate about, and something that, as of recently, I find is, there's a lot of research coming out with different diets. And I think even the term diet can be a little bit convoluting and a little confusing at times. So I hope that some of the information that we'll talk about today will help clarify some things, as well as maybe shed light on something that you have heard before, possibly even something that you are doing or have done before, and something that you can continue to do or possibly change if this is something that's important to you and impactful for you. So we have a fairly dense presentation to get through, so I'm going to get started. And we do ask, as Rebecca said, hold those questions until the end. But you can put them in the chat box as we go along, just in case you forget. Okay, no problem. And then we will address them at the end. Okay, so without further ado, let's start. So let's talk about popular diets and cancer. So our goal today is to discuss 4 particular diets, okay, that are typically common within the oncology space. We're going to review each diet and explain some of their characteristics. And then we'll for sure examine the research that relates to that diet, okay? And any implication on cancer risk, prevention, or potentially even benefits during treatment. So I will say that, again, the goal of our presentation today is to create awareness around diets and the recent research on the impact that these may have with prevention as well as treatment. But of course, as with anything, it's very important to speak to your oncologist, your physician, a registered dietitian like myself, and or other aspects of your care team before you start any new dietary protocol. And this is just to assure that it is safe and that it is right for you, because realistically, many of these things are not necessarily going to be right for everyone. Okay, so I just like to definitely stipulate that from the beginning. So these are the 4 diets we're going to discuss. We're going to talk a little bit about intermittent fasting. We're going to talk about the ketogenic diet. We're also going to touch on the fasting mimicking diet, as well as the Mediterranean diet. So let's dive into intermittent fasting. I think a lot of us are fairly familiar with the concept, but for clarification, intermittent fasting is really just an umbrella term for many different patterns of calorie restriction or time-restricted eating, okay? Some common intermittent fasting protocols that you'll see are just going to be the daily time-restricted feeding, alternate day fasting, the 5-2 fast or the 5-2 diet, and alternate day energy restriction. And we're going to go into some of those details on the next couple slides. So here you'll see an image. So these are really just representing different meal patterns. Okay, so you'll see that figure A on the left here represents a pattern that typically has 3 large meals and then 2 snacks, 1 snack being in between lunch and dinner, and then 1 snack after dinner. And I think some of us are keen on that. B represents 3 larger meals. This is consumed, however, during the day. C represents 2 normal meals, but you're going to be skipping breakfast. D represents 3 just small meals, but also consumed throughout the day. And then E represents a complete 24-hour fast. So how do these patterns get implicated with with what we just talked about, with some of those time-restricted eating protocols that I mentioned? Well, most of us, I think, typically consume that sort of A pattern, right? That's the common diet, right? Every day we usually have 3 meals and maybe a snack or 2, okay? But time-restricted feeding is going to be this pattern B here, okay? So that would be where, for example, you have 3 meals, and again, they're all constricted between that 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. Okay. The 5-2 diet. So the 5-2 diet is represented by 5 days of normal intake, but it could also be as a time-restricted feeding protocol, and then it's followed by 2 consecutive days of low calorie intake. Okay, so you can see that the 5-2 diet here is represented by figures D and B. So you see that D represents those 3 really small meals consumed during the day, followed by those 5 days of B, where you're just consuming your normal calorie diet, but during the day. Alternate day fasting. Personally, for me, I think that this sounds kind of terrible. I think it sounds a little unreasonable, but this is a pattern that some people have followed, right? Where essentially you have your normal intake, so pattern A, and then that's going to be followed by a day where you do a complete 24-hour fast, followed by another day where you do pattern A, and then another 24-hour fast. So you simply alternate between a day where you eat normally and then a day where you eat nothing. Okay. This to me, though, doesn't seem like something that would be very socially simple, right? How would you line up all of your days, your things that you might have to do? And it seems to be like something that may not be really sustainable long term. Okay. Same thing with the alternate day energy restriction. So you can see alternate day energy restriction is a pattern of A followed by a pattern of D, where you go into those really 3 small calorie meals. Okay. So pattern A, pattern D, pattern A, pattern D. Now this seems a little bit more feasible to accomplish, I think, instead of having a complete 24-hour fast. But still, again, to me, how would it be socially acceptable? Perhaps it could be for some people, but alternately, maybe it's just something that is not easy to follow long term. So let's go a little bit more into detail about some of the differences in those intermittent energy restrictions. So intermittent energy restriction, those patterns were the 5-2 pattern and the alternate day energy restriction. So the 5-2 pattern, like I mentioned, was 2 days per week where you have very, very small meals. Okay, and this is usually where you consume less than 75% or 65 to 75% of your normal intake. So this would be an example, 5 days where you have 2,000 calories per day, and then 2 consecutive days, you're only going to have 500 or 600 calories in a row. Okay. Alternate day energy restriction, that's really just going to be where, again, you have that A pattern where you eat normally, and then the D pattern, which is going to be about 75% of your normal intake. And then you're going to go back to the A pattern. So again, if you have 2,000 calories on Monday, Tuesday, you're going to have 500 calories. And then Wednesday, you're going to have 2,000. Thursday, you're going to have 500. Okay, so you just go back and forth. So some research has shown that these types of patterns are actually a little bit more feasible and potentially equally as beneficial for long-term adherence compared to time-restricted feeding, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. Okay, and the reason for this is that you're able to still consume some moderate portions of calories, and in particular, cancer patients, if they consume about 50 grams of protein on those days when they're not eating as many calories, this can actually help with muscle maintenance. So let's dig a little deeper into time-restricted feeding specifically. So many people are probably familiar with this, but it's really just defined as limiting your nutritional intake to a specified number of hours during the day. Okay, so this would be, for example, 12 hours of fasting and a 12-hour eating window, which is really what that B schedule represents. But there have been other forms of fasting where you can extend your fast. So you may have a 13-hour fast, or even a 14, a 16, or an 18-hour fast. I've seen some people do a 20-hour fast. When I used to be a personal trainer, they did a lot of these fasting protocols. So definitely different experiences for sure. So what do the results say about this time restricted feeding? So if you fast between 12 to 18 hours, what has the research shown? Well, it's shown that it's been very effective for weight loss in overweight or obese populations. And it actually may be even more efficacious when we combine it with calorie restriction over a 12-month period. So there was a study that they did. They had patients do time restricted feeding, or they had them do time restricted feeding in addition to calorie restriction. And they did this for a year. And the people that had the calorie restriction as well as the time restricted feeding actually lost more weight. So we know that it's beneficial for weight loss. It's also been shown to be beneficial for improving chronic disease biomarkers. So things like insulin resistance, your blood sugar control, blood pressure, cardiovascular health overall. It has been shown to help those kinds of biomarkers. But what about cancer? So there's a ton of research exploring this space right now. And I'll explain the image on the left in a minute. But we know that there has been some beneficial studies that have shown that intermittent fasting, or even just a time-restricted feeding protocol, may actually help improve the efficacy of chemotherapy treatments. Okay, and I'll explain the mechanism of why in a minute. And in particular, in breast cancer patients, they found that this particular protocol was able to decrease their levels of insulin and something called IGF-1, which has been known to exacerbate some forms of cancer cells. They did a very large study, a study of over 2,400 women, and they found that there was actually a decreased risk of recurrence in patients that had fasted for at least 13 hours per night. Okay. However, I will say the caveat of that study was that they didn't do an analysis of their specific dietary intake. So we don't know if, even though they were fasting for those 13 hours, we have no idea what they were eating for those 11 hours. Okay, so there could be some convoluted information on that, but nevertheless, it does show that fasting may be a potential benefit for breast cancer, reducing breast cancer recurrence. So explaining this slide on the left, it's very detailed and it's kind of a lot, but I want to explain it and try to make it simple for you. So in the blue, okay, we see that we think about our healthy cells, okay, just cells that do not have cancer, okay? So we know that these kinds of cells have an ability to adapt when there is no nutrients available, okay? So when we haven't eaten, or and if we haven't eaten for a long period of time, okay, our healthy cells have these mechanisms to adapt to that. Cancer cells, on the other end, do not. They have this inflexibility to adapt to what we call starvation, right? They are so pro-growth that they are not able to know what to do when there's no nutrients available. Okay, so short-term fasting, which is that STF, as we mentioned with the time-restricted feeding, may help lower levels of IGF-1, like I mentioned, could promote cancer growth. And it also reduces the amount of glucose or sugar within our cells available to them. Okay, this is the proposed mechanism for being able to essentially starve a cancer cell. Okay, without these available nutrients circulating in our system, it's more likely for the cancer cell to struggle and have no protection against chemotherapy. Okay, now the mechanism is that by our healthy cells fasting, they may actually have increased protection against chemotherapy, and the cancer cell has less protection, therefore rendering the chemotherapy or the radiation therapy more effective. Okay, and that has been shown in a few studies, but still has yet to be officially determined to where we can make this a true recommendation during treatment. So what are some key takeaways? Well, we know that time-restricted feeding is really considered safe and it is effective It's effective for inducing a degree of weight loss as well as improving those biomarkers. And it may also help improve effectiveness of those chemotherapy regimens. It may work to reduce the risk of recurrence in breast cancer patients. But again, we still need a little bit more studies determining this as far as across the board. And some questions to ask, though, are, is this sustainable or is it necessary long term? Do we have to follow this time-restricted feeding protocol forever? Is this something that we have to do forever to maintain our risk of reduce our risk of recurrence? We don't know yet. We don't have all those answers. And then most importantly, does the timing of our fasting matter? Is 12-hour fast as effective as 13? Is it as effective as 14? Or does it matter? So these are some questions that research is really seeking to try and answer. So that was our first diet. We're going to move on to the ketogenic diet, which I know people are familiar with. Okay, we're going to hopefully clear up some information about the keto diet in these next subsequent slides. So what is a keto diet? Well, it's really a diet that consists of very low carbohydrates, extremely high fat intake, and moderate or modest amounts of protein. Okay, so really if you think about the macronutrient profile of a ketogenic diet, it's going to be almost 70 or 75% coming from fat. Okay, 20% of the calories may come from protein, and no more than 5 to 10% of the calories will come from carbohydrates. Okay, so just as an example, if you're thinking again about a 2,000 calorie diet, based on these percentages, it would be about 165 grams of fat per day, no more than 100 grams of protein per day, and no more than 25 grams of carbohydrates per day. So what does 25 grams of carbs look like? Well, it's about a quarter of a cup of oatmeal. That's the amount of carbohydrate that would exist in a ketogenic diet. So where do we get fat from? Okay, this might be familiar to some people, but I'd always like to just say that fat is typically found in nuts and seeds. So things like walnuts, pumpkin seeds, almonds, pistachios, chia, and flax seeds. Those are great sources. We know avocados and olives are very high in fat. We also have oils, so extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, canola oil, and then it also comes from fish, right? So we have salmon, sardines, tuna. These all have very healthy sources of fat. I'll put MCT oil off kind of to the side, but I'm sure people are familiar with the concept of MCT oil. MCT oil stands for medium chain triglycerides, and it's a very common supplement to be consumed if you are on a ketogenic diet. So while those are some healthy fat sources, we also know that fat can come from other forms. Okay, we know that fat also exists in high-fat dairy products, so like whole milk, cheese, creams, butters, those kinds of things. It's also found in actual meat, right? So beef, pork, and lamb. It's also found in some poultry like chicken thighs, turkey thighs, and it's even in processed meats, right? So bacon, salami, any sort of cured meat. And it's found in fast food or convenience foods like burgers, fries, chicken wings, donuts. But all of those things would not be able to be had on a ketogenic diet because those things are also very high in carbohydrates. So I'd like to explain a little bit about what keto or ketosis is. So keto comes from the breakdown of fat. Okay, so fat is used as the primary source of energy. So we see here this little dial, you've got your 75% fat intake, your very low carbohydrate, and your modest protein intake. So when you enter a state of ketosis, your body shifts its metabolism from breaking down carbs for energy into breaking down fat for energy. Now, we're only really going to utilize our body fat for energy in ketosis if we're in a state of fasting. Okay, so if we are not consuming the amount of calories that we need to maintain weight, then we will tap into our body fat. Okay, so in doing so, this helps bring down our glucose, it brings down our insulin levels, and that essentially signals our liver to produce what we call ketone bodies. Okay, those are the three little chemical signals on the right-hand side here. And these ketone bodies can be used by our brain, by our heart, and by our muscle. This is just an image kind of explaining two slightly different versions of a ketogenic diet. What I'm really referring to with all of these is a standard ketogenic diet. But for some people who have more active schedules, so let's just say you are an athlete or you are very physically active, you may benefit from a targeted keto diet. Okay, this is a slightly lower amount of fat, a very slight modest increase in carbohydrates, and these carbohydrates are centered specifically around your exercise. So how does all of this relate to cancer or cancer metabolism? Well, like I mentioned, cancer cells obtain their energy primarily from glucose. They also can obtain some energy from protein, okay? But there are specific pathways that we know and that we have learned are associated with this cancer cell growth. Now, it's postulated that many cancers likely do not have the ability to utilize ketone bodies for energy. But as I mentioned, things like our brain, our heart, our muscle, they can. Okay, so they have that adaptive ability to utilize different forms of energy. So what do some of the studies say? What have we checked about the keto diet in cancer? Well, there was a very large analysis from 2021. They found 45 different studies. I just highlighted a few here. So in 57 patients that had prostate cancer, they did the keto diet for about 6 months, and they did find that they had a greater degree of weight loss than the patients who did not, but there was no change to their PSA levels or anything else. So it wasn't really that conclusive. Okay? In 77 patients that had advanced breast cancer, they followed this diet for 3 months, and they actually found that there was prolonged survival in patients that had followed the diet prior to the start of chemotherapy or radiation therapy. And I find that to be very interesting because that seems to me an area of research that we should expand upon. That timing of the diet might be equally as important as the diet itself. They also found that in these patients, they did have a greater degree of weight loss, smaller waist circumference. And this particular study, they used those MCT oils. Okay, so the ketogenic diet was MCT oil based. In another study of ovarian and endometrial cancer, they had 73 patients. They did the diet over 3 months. They compared the standard ketogenic diet to the American Cancer Society diet, which is just a low-fat, high-fiber diet. And they only really found that they had improved body composition. So really what this is telling me is that we need more studies, of course, right? But we know that this is more likely to be helpful where you need a lot of weight loss. But the question remains that sometimes during treatment, we don't always want weight loss. Weight loss is not always good during treatment. So we definitely still need a lot more studies when it comes to this particular diet. However, most of the promise with this diet has been found to be in patients that have glioblastomas or some of the more neurologically connected cancers. And they did find that in 2022, that a review found that glioma patients did have reduced tumor size. So there are some limitations to this diet. Not sure if anybody has ever tried a true ketogenic diet, but it is very difficult. It is very, very challenging to maintain. There are some limitations to it. You really struggle with fiber intake, and your plant diversity is very small. There's plenty of studies that have shown benefit of high fiber intake and plant diversity when it comes to reducing risk of cancer. So this comes into play a little bit with, is the diet, going to be something that's beneficial long term? Micronutrient deficiencies are not uncommon, especially if the diet is being followed long term. Things like potassium, vitamin C, magnesium, you can run out of those things very quickly, especially if you're not consuming specific types of vegetables, which you won't be on the diet. Next, as I mentioned, adherence, right? Maintaining this diet, it's very restrictive in nature. So it can be very challenging long-term in social situations. And then again, as I mentioned, do we really need to follow it long-term? We don't know. We don't know. So what are some big takeaways? Well, we know that it may create an environment that assists standard therapies in destroying cancer cells, but we know we need more research to really prove that. It's definitely possible to promote weight loss and improve body composition, which may be the reason why it can help reduce risk of recurrence. But it does cause micronutrient deficiencies and reduce overall fiber intake. So we really need to keep studying and see if there's going to be any further results that come from these sorts of diets. All right, moving on to diet 3. This is a good piggyback off of the ketogenic diet because this particular diet does have ketogenic-like effects. And this is called the fasting mimicking diet. It's a fairly new concept and still in its infancy, but it was created by a man named Walter Longo. He's a physician that studies out of USC as well as Italy, and he's primarily focused on longevity. So this diet was really formulated more to assess how it impacts different species and their ability to live longer, as well as cancer prevention. So how these species potentially live longer without disease. Primarily has been studied in rats and animals. This is really because those populations tend to have very high rates of cancer. So he thought that this would be a good way to assess to see if we can translate this into more human populations. They have started more recently in the last few years studying the effects in cancer patients during treatment. So we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So I want to provide a little bit of the theory behind why he came up with this. So we know that calorie restriction has actually been shown to increase lifespan and reduce risk of chronic diseases in multiple species. As I mentioned, rats, there's also flies, yeast, monkeys. It's been proven pretty much across the board that calorie restriction of those animals reduces their risk of chronic disease and can improve their lifespan. Not sure if anybody recalls any of this, but in the early 90s, there was an experiment called the Biosphere 2. The Biosphere 2 is this big, it's supposed to kind of be like a self-sufficient ecosystem, and it's in Arizona, and it's supposed to function as if we were living on a planet we couldn't go anywhere else. So this Biosphere 2 has all these different rainforests, different ecosystems within it. So in the early 90s, they sent 8 people in to go on this experiment for 2 years. So they were going to be stuck in this little bubble for 2 years. And it was really more of a social experiment. They wanted to see how this population did with having to figure out its own food sources, having to figure out how to work together in small groups. But they miscalculated how much they really needed to provide them with food and how much they needed to give them to grow and populate. So the group that went in on this experiment ended up having unplanned calorie restriction for 2 years. Okay, so the 2 years that they were in there, they had, I can't remember the exact number, but they probably had only about 60% of their normal calories. So when they came out, they checked all of their blood work, and they actually found that these patients did have improved biomarkers to cancer, to aging, to heart disease, but they were severely, severely malnourished. So that goes into show that while some things improved, perhaps long-term, this concept of calorie restriction can be more detrimental. Okay. So the FMD was really created to provide the benefits that long-term fasting can have on your biomarkers without the risk of malnutrition. So the goal of this diet is technically to be performed about 4 times per year. So here's the brief synopsis. Really, the calorie restriction, as I mentioned before, will lead to that decreased nutrient availability within the body, which would then downregulate our body's ability to grow, or it would stimulate something called autophagy. Not sure if anybody has heard that term before, but it's called programmed cell death. So think of it like a cleanup, right? We all know, if as the time goes on, chaos builds within our house, things start cluttering, and then we get on this big, massive cleaning spree and we get rid of it. Well, think of autophagy as that within our bodies. So when we have decreased nutrient availability, we're going to do all this big cellular cleanup and make it look nice and pretty. Okay, that is the concept of autophagy. So by these two things happening, by a downregulated growth pathway and by autophagy, this should in turn help reduce our risk of developing cancer and promoting longevity. But as we know, how can we tell if humans are living longer as a result of calorie restriction? Very, very complicated concept, very multifactorial. And I think that is going to be very challenging to prove within the human lifespan and the human population. So what does the FMD look like? Well, the first day you start with moderate calories. So about 1,100 calories. You consume maybe 500 from carbs, about 500 from fat, and you give yourself about 25 grams of plant-based protein. But throughout this, to make sure that you don't develop those micronutrient deficiencies, take a multivitamin as well as omega-3 fatty acids, because this entire diet is plant-based. There is no animal protein in this diet whatsoever. So day 1, you kind of lead yourself into fasting, and then days 2 through 5, you have about an 800 calorie intake, about 350 calories from carbs, 350 from fat, and again, you continue with that 25 grams of plant-based protein, the multivitamin, and omega-3s. So what did they find? Well, they did find in a study that the fasting mimicking diet was actually found to be safe, and it was feasible in about 101 cancer patients. Now you might think, okay, well that's good that it was 101 cancer patients, but if you think about the number of cancer patients across the world, 101 may not be convincing enough, right? It's a number, it's certainly a good number, but how can we extrapolate this to an entire population? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. There was a recent study that was done in HER2-negative breast cancer patients. They had 131 different patients, and they assessed adherence. So is this diet something that could be performed throughout the entirety of the chemotherapy cycles? Well, 80% of this population was able to complete a fasting mimicking diet through their first chemo cycle, but only 50 were able to make it to the next cycle, 33 through 4 cycles, and 20% through all. So it kind of goes to show that it may be challenging to do back to back to back. Again, their chemotherapy regimens are highly variable, and that may also be something that is worth exploring a little bit more. Perhaps this kind of diet needs a break in between. Maybe it's not something that can be performed once a month. Or even once every 2 or 3 weeks, which is common for chemotherapy. So definitely need more research. However, in the group that did perform that fasting mimicking diet, they did find that those patients were 2.5 times less likely to have progressive disease, or even stable disease, which means no improvement throughout the regimen. So that's actually important to note, because that means that these patients actually had a stronger partial or complete response to therapy. So we're seeing a common trend here is that it's possible that fasting can be beneficial throughout treatment, but is very heterogeneous and actually may not be possible or feasible or possibly even safe for some of the population. So what are the biggest limitations of the fasting mimicking diet? Well, even though I showed you this concept here, right, the protocol, this diet is not possible to be done really at home, okay? It's not easily replicated at all with food, okay? Currently, it is only commercially available through one specific company, and it really should be done under close medical supervision, okay? This diet has a very, very, very specific dietary formulation that comes in the form of bars, dehydrated soups, drinks, herbal teas, crackers, and olives, okay? It's also nut-based. There are no non-allergenic or hypoallergenic versions of this diet. So if you have any allergies to the nuts, You're not capable of performing this diet, which to a degree seems not smart. And to a degree seems like there could be something that could be done with something that might be hypoallergenic, I should say. So not nut-based. So what are the biggest takeaways? Well, it might promote longevity. We're still doing a lot of research, but there's positive research that is supporting that. It also may reduce the risk of developing cancer through those mechanisms that we talked about that were associated with calorie restriction. It might also promote positive outcomes during chemotherapy, but we definitely still need more clinical trials and more studies to really assess if this is a diet that is beneficial for long-term. It is also very limited at this point, given that there's only one company that really does this. Also, it's very costly because of that. Its formulation is really, it's going to be very limited. Only a certain number of people are going to be able to do this. So I find that to be a bit of a limitation. All right, my favorite and final diet, the Mediterranean diet. And I know that most people have heard of this diet, but we're going to go into some details about it to really hit the nail on the head here. So we know we've talked about fasting. We've talked about different forms of fasting. We've talked about a very specific dietary protocol through the fasting mimicking diet. But now we're going to talk about a dietary pattern that I find is far more sustainable and far more research is associated with it from a very positive standpoint. There's almost no research that demonstrates this diet to be not beneficial. So what is the Mediterranean diet? Well, it's really a dietary pattern that is characterized predominantly by plants, okay, moderate portions of fish and seafood, a limited intake of eggs, poultry, and dairy, and then avoidance or extremely limited intake of red meat, pork, and sweets, okay? Red wine is included, however, it should be included really in moderation. So I love this image here. I just think it captures the concepts very well. So you guys can see at the very bottom, right? We've got people that are physically active. So a very strong component of this diet is not nutritional, okay? It's physical activity related. And I think that's something that unfortunately in the United States, we don't get enough of. We are not getting enough physical activity. Less than 50% of the population meets the recommendation for exercise and physical activity per week. I encourage people to put it in the chat box if you think you know what the exercise recommendations are on a weekly basis. If not, no stress. I'll probably tell you. Somebody will ask a question and I'll tell you towards the end. But physical activity of any kind is important, okay? You'll also see at the bottom, in that bottom right corner, there's people eating together, right? So social interactions. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to sit and have dinner with somebody or sit and have lunch or have breakfast, but really the concept is social interactions and it's having support, right? I think of this particular community, the cancer community, support is so important, whether it's at diagnosis, at time of treatment, after diagnosis, after prevention of recurrence, right? After finishing treatment, support is so important. And for the people that are in those caregiving positions, for people who are going through treatment, it's a stressor for you as well. So if you're in a caregiving position, you need support as well. So again, hitting the nail on the head that physical activity and support are the basis for this diet, okay? Things that you'll notice in that next level: vegetables, fruits, whole grains, olive oil, beans, nuts, legumes, these kinds of things. So plants are the foundation of the diet, okay? And not just like, one plant here, one plant there, a variety, right? So a variety of plants is essential to this diet, okay? Fish and seafood should form the next animal protein base of the diet. So salmon, mackerel, tuna, some of those healthy fat fish that I had mentioned before. Again, seafood could be, shrimp. It could be also, scallops, those kinds of things. But those form the basis of the animal protein intake, okay? And then very modest portions of poultry, eggs, and dairy, things that might have higher levels of cholesterol, also things that might have slightly higher levels of saturated fat, okay? Meats and sweets, very much at the top there, limiting those to as little as possible. So this gives some details about servings of the different types of foods that I mentioned. So vegetables, really the recommendation for vegetables is at least 2 servings per meal, not day. 2 servings per meal, or about 6 servings of vegetables every day, okay? And fruit, about 1 to 2 servings per meal, or you could do 3 servings per day. Grains and breads, these are going to be 1 to 2 servings per meal. So grains, think like brown rice, think quinoa, think farro, think barley, those kinds of things. Breads, again, whole grain bread preferably, possibly even sourdough fits in there as well. But about 1 to 2 servings per meal, or up to 8 servings of grains or bread daily. 2 to 4 servings, excuse me, of eggs per week. Fish, legumes, and nuts should be had at least 3 times per week. But nuts, I would say you can have those every day. Same with beans, you could even have those every single day. Poultry, limit that to 2 to 4 servings per week. And then red meat and sweets, fewer than or no more than 2 to 3 times per week. So what does the research say? Well, we know that adherence to the Mediterranean diet was specifically associated with a decreased incidence of 9 cancers. Over 9 cancers were shown to be reduced by following this dietary pattern. And this is really attributed to the antioxidant content that is present in the diet, the omega-3 content that is present in the diet, as well as the fiber intake. So antioxidants are these things that help prevent damage. Okay, these are things that are found in colorful fruits and vegetables. Okay, so your vitamin C, your selenium, okay, your colorful antioxidants are things like beta carotene, right, in the carrots, the oranges, those kinds of things. Okay? And then fiber, I really want to hit fiber as an essential part of not only health, but also for your microbiome, right, for your gut bacteria. So the average fiber intake on a Mediterranean diet is 35 grams per day. Most Americans get around 12 on a consistent basis. So it's really important to try to bump up that fiber intake. And that kind of leads us into this concept with colorectal cancer patients. So there's a very strong association between lower colorectal cancer and higher fiber intake. So the more fiber that you intake, the lower your risk of developing colorectal cancer. So that is essential. Red meat, however, was inversely correlated. So the more red meat that you consumed, the more risk was of getting colorectal cancer. And we often found that that was as a result of a lack of fiber as well. So not that red meat causes colorectal cancer. That's very complicated. It's more difficult to understand. But we find that it definitely increases our risk of developing colorectal cancer. So another study done in colorectal cancer patients that had something called cachexia. Cachexia is this stress-associated muscle loss that can happen during cancer. It can happen as a result of the cancer, or it can also happen as a result of the treatment as you're going through cancer. So they found in 46 colorectal cancer patients that a Mediterranean diet improved their body composition. They were able to decrease their inflammation or their inflammatory markers, and they actually had improved physiological function. Okay, so very, very important. In a very, very, very large study of patients with invasive breast cancer, this was done in Europe, this was done in Spain over the span of, I think it was over 20 years was the total that they had collected patients. But they studied about 4,200 patients that had invasive breast cancer that went through treatment. They were anywhere between 60 to 80 years old, and they did a follow-up of an average of 4.8 years. So let's just say someone was diagnosed with this breast cancer in 2005. They went through their treatment. They were put on a Mediterranean diet, and then they followed them and they checked again in 5 years to assess their risk of recurrence. So the different diets that they had placed them on were either a Mediterranean diet that was olive oil based, a Mediterranean diet that was nut based, or just a standard kind of basic low fat diet. Okay. They found that the patients that were on the Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil, there was only a 1.1 chance of or incidence of occurrence out of those 1,000 people. Okay, so out of 1,000 people, only 1.1 had recurrence. Okay. Out of a study with the nuts, okay, the ones that followed the Mediterranean diet with nuts, 1.8 of them out of 1,000 had recurrence. The low-fat diet, 2.9. So that just tells you the power of this diet, right? The power of this diet, either from extra virgin olive oil or from nuts, potentially even the combination of the two. It should be shown as something that will help with reducing overall incidence and recurrence. So what are the biggest takeaways? Well, we know that the Mediterranean diet is very high in antioxidants, high in fiber, high in omega-3s, and that's what makes it so ideal for reducing cancer incidence at all, right? We know that it's helpful for improving body composition, and we know that it can help reduce overall inflammation. And the beauty of this diet is that while it's titled the Mediterranean diet, this concept or this pattern here can be followed by nearly any culture, right? If you are Mexican, if you're Colombian, if you are Italian, if you are from any part of the globe, you can follow a pattern that is similar to this and still maintain your cultural identity and your cultural foods. So I think that that is one that's really, really important. So these are my references. These were the combination of studies and all the things that I researched along the way. I want to say that the very bottom here, number 19, the AICR.org, it stands for the American Institute for Cancer Research. It's a wonderful website that has loads of information, great graphics, some interactive activities that are really good for just learning about food and navigating your way through both cancer prevention as well as even treatment and survivorship. So I definitely encourage everybody to check that website out. Okay. I thank you all so much for your time. I hope this was informative and I hope this was thought-provoking. And I want to invite questions.
Thank you so much, Marissa. That was a wealth of information and so well explained. If we do have some time for questions, please feel free to put it into the chat, or you can do what Angela did and raise your hand or mute yourself, and that'll indicate to me that you have a question. So I'll do the one in the chat first. Just to answer your question about how much exercise to get in a week, someone wrote 90 minutes and another person wrote 150 minutes.
Excellent. Whoever said 150 minutes, you are correct. So 150 minutes across the week. We recommend that would be moderate to vigorous intensity. Okay, so you should be huffing and puffing. Okay, not like you're on like gonna pass out or anything, but definitely feeling like you're huffing and puffing and having to work really hard and sweat. Awesome job.
Wonderful. First question, what do you think about unsweetened coconut cream? I put some in shakes.
Yeah, so with specific foods, you know, there's no one specific food that is going to be detrimental, right? I try not to make people think that, you know, this one food is going to be is a problem, right? We think about the overall dietary pattern, okay, just like what I just talked about. So I think unsweetened coconut cream absolutely has a place in a healthy diet. Just know that from coconuts, it does have a higher amount of saturated fat. It does have a small amount of those MCTs, or those medium chain triglycerides. Kind of hard to say fast. So I will say just be mindful of it in total, just be from a saturated fat standpoint. We really recommend no more than 13 to 20 grams of saturated fat per day. And that's for really a standard like 2,000 calorie diet, right? So if your normal calories should be a little bit less than that, I would consider keeping a little bit less than that. So I hope that was helpful and answered your question.
Thank you. Angela, go ahead with your question.
Yes, when there was a talk about the portions for the different categories, I do not understand what is a portion.
Great question. I was hoping somebody would answer that. So I can kind of flip back to that slide. All right. So one portion of vegetables is a cup, or excuse me, a half a cup. Okay. So if we say 6 portions daily, 6 half-cup servings daily. Okay. For fruit, same thing. Portion is a half a cup. Okay. For things that are like berries and melons, so for blueberries, for strawberries, for the melon, so like watermelon, honeydew, those kinds of portions are a cup. But every other piece of fruit is half a cup. For the grains is kind of a little bit tricky, but we say about an average of half a cup to 3/4 of a cup. Okay. One slice of bread, and we say a small slice of bread, the small, like the thin slices of the bread, that would be 1 serving. Okay. For beans, okay, so beans, a serving of beans is a half a cup. And for poultry, we would say a serving is about 2 ounces. I hope that helps.
Yes, a lot.
Great.
Thank you. Great question. Rebecca, go ahead with your question.
Me?
Yes, go ahead,
Hi.
Rebecca.
So we all know that our doctors aren't educated in nutrition, right? So when I was diagnosed with cancer, my doctor said, just eat fruits, vegetables, and protein. And I thought, well, that's what I eat now, and I have cancer. So I kind of laughed at that, right? I go, he didn't tell me anything new. So then I thought, let me go to a dietitian and see what the dietitian says. So mind you, this was a regular dietitian. When I was asking her, hey, do you know anything about, is it different with a regular patient versus a patient with cancer as far as, dietitian information? And she goes, well, I really haven't been educated in how, cancer relates to the dietitian. And I thought, okay, so now do I need to get a dietitian that knows about cancer?
Great question. I think that if that is available to you, I think it can be very helpful because they'll be better able to kind of look at if you're going through chemotherapy, they'll be able to look at those regimens and maybe understand some of the nutrition related side effects that can happen. They might also be aware of a little bit more up-to-date research, but again, not everybody, I have to be honest, staying up to date with research is actually very difficult. They make it seem like it's easy, but it's actually very difficult, very time consuming, kind of like learning about politics. So I would say that it can be beneficial to find a dietitian that has, sort of that specialty. But if not, I would at least inquire about somebody who perhaps works with those patients more frequently, just so they, again, have that exposure. But I would say that still a more general dietitian, they may still be able to help you work your way through this for sure.
Okay, great.
Thank
you.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat. Can you say more about MCTs?
Sure. So MCT, like I said, it stands for medium chain triglycerides. So I'll explain it like if you think of like a long necklace of beads, right? So a normal fat that you might find, let's just say in salmon, is going to be a really long chain of fatty acids, okay, or triglycerides. And MCT is going to be half that size, so a smaller and shorter chain of fat put together. And that has been shown to be metabolized a little bit differently. So it doesn't have to be broken down and chopped down bit by bit, the same as those really long chains do. So the MCTs have been shown to be beneficial for patients that maybe need assistance with weight gain, And they're just a little bit better at helping kind of get directly into the bloodstream without having to kind of chop down so much. I think in the, again, like the ketogenic space, there's a lot of information about the benefits of MCTs for like brain health and things like that. But again, I'm not 100% familiar about that research, but I would say that still kind of proceed with caution on all of those things, because again, MCTs are still like, they're still very caloric, right? And again, most of this would only really be beneficial if you're having a hard time with like maintaining weight, or if you really are doing more of like a therapeutic ketogenic diet. So the average person really doesn't need to like supplement with a bunch of MCTs. So it's really kind of specific to those diets.
Thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If you have any, please feel free to put them into the chat. Go ahead, iPhone.
Yes, I just have a question. Do you think it's a good idea to try to avoid preservatives and sugar, added sugar especially?
Yeah, so I mean, broadly, you know, added sugar, we recommend no more than 24 to 36 grams per day.
Okay.
So that's about 6 teaspoons, I think. So most of the added sugars are going to be found sort of in like more of the packaged products, right? So
Right.
you know, crackers, the bars, like those kinds of things are where you're going to see
Mhm.
that. Anything that's like flavored, right? Like flavored oatmeal, has like 15 grams of sugar in it, you know?
Right.
So we say just kind of be mindful of that in total, but complete avoidance of that is not necessarily necessary. And then I'm sorry, what was your second question?
Um, preservatives.
Oh, preservatives. I think
Preservatives.
that's nearly impossible to avoid. I mean, again, the
Yeah.
preservatives are going to be found primarily in like some of those packaged products. But sometimes the preservatives are necessary. You know, again, they can keep us from contracting mold and different bacterias and things, you know.
Right.
So I think it would be nearly impossible to avoid preservatives. But again, focusing on more of like a whole food, plant forward diet, you're naturally going to be getting somewhat less preservatives in your diet, right?
Right.
So
Like, or sprouted bread, like
yeah,
from Trader Joe's, and yeah. Okay.
it's still going to have some in it for sure, because again, that's
Yes.
how it maintains its shelf stability, right?
Right.
But you know, fruits, vegetables, oats, like those kinds of things, you know, won't really have any preservatives. So
Okay.
focusing on much of that, I think you're better off.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Last question. Go ahead, Angeles.
Yeah, in regards to the fruit, I usually only feel comfortable eating fruit in the morning with yogurt, but I eat a variety of fruit quite a bit. Would that be enough for the entire day, or do I have to divide it through the day?
No, I don't think you have to divide it. I think if that works for you, and you're getting, you know, those servings of fruits, then I think that's great. I will say that if you do have any sort of challenges with blood sugar, or if you have another chronic disease, like if you have diabetes or something like that, or even pre-diabetes, that a large amount of fruit all at once and in the morning sometimes can spike your blood sugars. So I don't know if that's the case for you. You don't have to say that if that is the case, but just in general, if that is the case for anybody, sometimes having a large portion of fruit in the morning can increase blood sugars if you have dysregulation issues. So, but if you have no issues and that is the best time for you to have the fruit, keep at it. No, not a problem at all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marissa, for such a wonderful presentation.
My